in horribly cramped and dangerous conditions. Gravity seems to be the sole reason many of these homes are still standing. It's hard to imagine how humans could withstand this force, enough to uproot trees and sweep away 9-story-high apartment blocks. This is what happened to some of the buildings. Look, it's pushed all the way through several walls down here. And then once you're inside, it's covered with mud. Every single room is full of mud. There are trees in the middle of this building, and I don't even know what floor we're actually on. There are a few foreign teams helping out now, but it's amid criticism that there are far too few and they're far too late. Many are using shovels and picks to try to find their relatives on their own.
There's no help. There's nobody to help. There's no government. They've been buried here for 5 days.
Who wants to carry on knowing their family are buried there rotting? Please help us and have mercy on us. We've suffered enough.
An estimated 10,000 in Derna are still unaccounted for, and the international teams which have arrived seem unprepared for the scale of this disaster.
This is for us the first time we saw this disaster, because of the tsunami, this area there was 15 metri, 15 meters water for 50 minutes.
The geography of Derna has changed entirely, and nothing is as it was. Vehicles were tossed aside by the water torrent, thrown up and smashed down again. Sides of buildings have been torn apart, and family cars left wedged inside homes. Whole apartment blocks have been ripped off their foundations. This one's been lifted up by the water and dumped 40 meters away. It's left the whole city, the entire country, traumatized. Whole families were washed away, and thousands are now without homes. And they're still fishing out bodies from the ocean. These sites are not easy to see. The mechanical digger scoops up a young child's body amongst the debris. She looks like she's 10 or 11 years old. These are grim times for those suffering and those with the awful task of retrieving the thousands who died. This catastrophic disaster comes after years of neglect, civil war and a NATO bombing campaign which left the country awash with weapons. The country, split in two by competing governments in east and west, now has a city ripped apart by a natural disaster compounded by poor governance. Derna residents are insisting the authorities knew of the risk of the dams bursting, were told to build multiple extra dams, yet did nothing.
So that's what should have done. During these 45 years, we should have about 10 dams behind the second one to help, even in the branches.
If they'd done that, could this disaster have been averted?
Yeah, at least it will help. 10 dams like the second one, of course it will help, of course.
Residents insist there was no evacuation plan and they weren't even warned of the storm by the authorities. But the new Prime Minister of the East denied that to us and seemed to blame history pretty much for the disaster.
All the countries and governments who fight over Libya are only interested in our oil and our natural resources. The international community is only focused on oil and not on the unity of Libya.
Violent politics and vicious natural disasters are a toxic mix, and ordinary Libyans are paying for a catastrophe which many believe could and should have been averted, and which the country is utterly unable to deal with. Alex Crawford, Sky News in Derna.
And Alex joins me now from inside the city of Derna. Alex, it's almost impossible to comprehend how so much damage was caused in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's truly staggering. And honestly, I wasn't prepared for all the sights, and I imagine that's what a lot of the relief crews are going through. Indeed, many of the international crews actually told us that, saying that they weren't expecting this, because when you walk through the centre of Derna, what strikes you is how incredible amount of water there must have been, because you can tell this by how high the buildings have been destroyed, where the trees have ended up, where the vehicles have ended up. So a car being transported, you know, 3 or 4 stories high and ending up in someone's front room, that's extraordinary. You know, seeing the bottom of the valley and where the water started and seeing the trees up on top of a 15-story apartment block is just extraordinary. There are cars and vehicles all over the place, you know, top upside down, up against walls, you know, piled all together, out at sea, you know, or the coastline is packed with cars in, you know, in a sort of haphazard fashion, as though some sort of giant crazy toddler has just gone whack with the middle of the city centre and smashed it all. And that's what's happening in the city centre. Also, the crews that are landing have come. It's been difficult. I think that seems to be the pervading problem, that it's been difficult to get in to this part of Libya, and they've come in small numbers and quite late. It's nearly a week on now, and so there is a limit to what they can do. And there are lots of people in utter shock. The whole of the centre of Derna can't quite cope with what's happened. You know, entire apartment blocks absolutely wiped away. Can I show you just behind me, if you bear with me? That whole of that centre, which is just a flat, sandy bottom, that used to be packed, the most highly populated part of a very highly populated city. And that was wall to wall, like you can see behind it, the buildings are all up against each other and all jostling very, very close, little alleyways. That was what that empty patch of land was, packed full of buildings, apartment blocks, all sorts. If you look out at the sea, I don't know whether you can tell that there's a colour difference. That's how far the black, the darker colour is how far all the mud and the debris has infected the normally blue aqua colour Mediterranean. You can see Italian warships just stationed off who have been there for the past few days. I'm not exactly sure how long they've been there, but they've been there helping in the recovery of bodies which are still being washed up at shore and floating about in the ocean. But there is still hope, because we responded to a call late last night when we saw all the, late yesterday afternoon, when we saw all the relief crews running, and they'd got a call that they'd heard a voice of a woman underneath the rubble. And I must admit, we stayed and watched it. No one there could believe anyone had survived it, because this amount of force from one body of water, when whole buildings can't resist it, it's very difficult to imagine actual humans can resist it. Well, this morning we heard that that young woman was rescued. So there is still, like in all of these cases, they throw up these miracle survival people who have managed to somehow, against all the odds, come through it all. And we'll be hoping to bring you more of that later on.
Yeah, it's good to hear those tiny stories of hope, Alex, and the pictures you've been showing us really are quite staggering. You talked about how difficult it is for teams to get in. What about aid? Can you give us an update on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly a bit busier, and it's exponentially getting a tiny bit busier with more people going in. But we're talking about what appears to me to be, anyway, from a non-expert point of view, as far as relief aid goes, it appears to be a huge scale, a huge number of people who have either lost their homes, and that is an estimated 300,000, or who have lost relatives. There are more than 10,000 people unaccounted for. So we must presume that they're missing, maybe under rubble, or they've perished in this disaster. And then there's the ones that have actually died on top of it. So there's a huge amount of challenges facing this city in eastern Libya, you know, which is in a country which has enormous challenges, not least because there are two competing, opposing governments, authorities in the east and west, not least because of the history which dates back to the Arab Spring back in 2011, when a NATO-led campaign, military campaign, ousted the dictator, and all that, the problems that ensued from that, not least because the country was awash with weapons since and had a civil war that followed, and, you know, is reduced to, in some areas, extreme poverty. There are lots and lots of challenges here, and now they have a massive disaster, which by any means of measurement would challenge a really rich, fully functioning country, and there are not many of those around the world, let's face it. So the challenges here are enormous. The aid is beginning to come in. We're hearing about World Health Organization supplies arriving. We're hearing more and more crews come, relief crews coming. They have told us that there are more of them coming, but they are small compared to the problem, really small and sparse on the ground, and it's difficult to see a lot of the locals telling us, a lot of the Libyans doing it for themselves, traveling from Misrata, from Tripoli, from all parts of the country to help in what is a massive challenge on the ground, and they feel once again that they're not really getting the sort of response that, for instance, those sufferers in the Turkey earthquake got not so long ago. We saw that, and Sky was on the ground there in large numbers covering what went on there. We saw a massive international response to that. I don't feel, seriously, that has happened quite yet.
The year, the Wadi Derna River, which runs from the mountains to south of Derna, is usually dry. Heavy rain from Storm Daniel ran off the baked dry ground into the river. It caused 2 dams to collapse. The first was around 12 kilometres upstream from the city. The dam was completely destroyed, and questions have been raised over the condition of the dam due to a lack of maintenance. After breaching the first dam, water moved downstream in this canyon. The second dam was on the southern edge of the city. Video downstream shows the huge scale of water making its way down through the city centre, where homes and shops line the usually dry riverbed.
A prayer for those killed, the ones they could retrieve and dignify with a burial. The rising number of dead here in Derna is felt with every new body bag that arrives. One to replace every person they lay to rest.
It's just bone-chilling. You see how many bodies have already been buried, and that they're making more space for the bodies that are coming out today. And people just keep taking moments to pray for them, to mourn them, because this in itself is a luxury. So many more people are missing that will never get to be buried.
It's grueling work done by local volunteers who have to face this tragedy head-on. Abdullah is only 23 years old. How do you feel burying your people like this, I ask? It is so difficult, he says. Nothing I tell you could express just how deeply painful this is. But we belong to God, and to Him we return. The grief has barely hit. This is still pure shock. Just downhill from these mass graves in the mountains is a valley of devastation. A cyclone and 2 burst dams wiped out hundreds of generational homes and the families in them.
Well, it's completely broken in half. This was the second dam that the floodwaters hit before it tore into Derna and destroyed the city. Safwat, what is this dam called?
It's the Death Dam.
The Death Dam?
Yeah.
The dam of death, now just a gentle stream.
Tens of millions of cubic meters of water came rushing down this way as the dam broke and battering this school where families were actually sheltering from their homes further downhill. And this is actually where one family called the Sheikh family hid, and all of them, 27 women, men, and children died in this primary and secondary school.
The survivors say this wasn't a natural disaster. This was a catastrophe, fueled by political instability and infrastructural neglect. 2 hospitals were washed away by the floodwaters with the patients in them. This is one of the last standing clinics. The director of Derna's field hospital says this flood was on the scale of Noah and his ark. The city's medics are still receiving bodies, and they are still searching for them. An insurmountable task, with some bodies washed away to sea and others scattered under the ruins of their own city.
They here feel incredibly let down. They feel like these dams, the one just behind me, the last dam that burst just before the torrent of water is unleashed on them, is a symbol of just how preventable this catastrophe is. Now this valley, the devastated Wadi Derna Valley, is a symbol and a sign of so much that it tore through the city and split the city in half. You can just see from where the dam is, I mean, there's barely anything left. It's completely broken through. But there's also these houses that have been flung down towards the sea on the water's way out. And these homes were home to people who've lived here for generations. People have lived by the sea here. They have a great relationship with water. You know, it's their livelihood. But also this valley is usually dry. They've never seen this amount of water in one go. They've said that was more water rain in a year. And there's this real sense that this should never have happened. There are calls for accountability. There's calls for an inquiry. There's questions rightfully asked about why this wasn't looked into. Now, these dams were built in the 70s, and they haven't been touched, properly maintained in 20 years, even though money has been allocated for their maintenance. So the question is, how could this happen as people are dealing with the cost of this disaster?
It was a natural disaster, but much more than that, a man-made one too. First, nature. Storm Daniel was severe, forming over the Ionian Sea on September the 4th. It became Greece's worst storm in recorded history. The flooding there and in Bulgaria and Turkey was serious enough to kill more than 20 people. Nowhere near the numbers we've seen in Libya, but it should have been warning of its power. Now, the storm tracked south across the Mediterranean towards Africa. And from the 8th of September, Libya's National Meteorological Centre issued warnings of heavy rain. But as it moved towards Derna, the population was still in place. The head of the World Meteorological Survey said that evacuations should have been ordered, but authorities there told the population to hunker down instead. This video showing the waters around Al Sahaba Mosque. Now, in these photos on Sunday, the 10th of September, the mayor's meeting with the Security Directorate to discuss the curfew they say was put in place for citizens' safety. Now, that Facebook page has since been filled with comments criticising the decision, one of them saying history would judge them. This video, verified by Sky News, shows what happened. It's in the early hours, the rains have come, but it isn't the main danger. Suddenly, there is a huge torrent. It carries cars along like they're toys, and that is the dams bursting. Because the threat to Derna was not so much the storm itself, but the dams lying above the town, right near the town, and then the upper down here, both built in the 1970s. A hydrological report published just last year warned that maintenance was specifically required to prevent catastrophic flooding. It said if a 1959 flood was repeated in the same size, especially in the current situation, that may cause one of the two dams to collapse, making the residents of the valley and the city of Derna vulnerable. There is a high risk of flooding. But the deputy mayor of Derna has said that neither dam had been maintained since 2002. And this is what the upper dam looked like before the storm. You can see shrubs growing along the dam crest. And this is what remained afterwards. The dam completely obliterated.
There's no such thing as a natural disaster, so there might be an extreme weather event, but it's that interplay with the community, the governance, the people on the ground that leads to that risk. In this case, if the dams were not there, then we wouldn't have seen that large loss of life as a result of their collapse.
Meteorological warnings unheeded, and evacuation that didn't happen, dams that weren't maintained. There's been so much death and despair in Derna, and so much of it might have been avoidable.
Around the world, the Libyan community is united in grief. At Cheadle Mosque in Manchester, they're praying for the survivors and a speedy response to the disaster.
One of our volunteers has lost more than 11 of her own family members, and one of our partners as well. 65 of his family members were lost in the floods. Almost an entire bloodline washed away.
Many countries have now pledged assistance. Turkish teams were some of the first to reach the disaster zone. But the scale of this catastrophe is huge. In Geneva, crates of body bags are loaded up. Neighbouring countries have deployed search and rescue teams and are also sending medical supplies, food, tents and blankets. But getting aid to where it's needed most in Libya is complicated by the nation's chaotic politics. Since Muammar Gaddafi was deposed, the country has been divided.
I think the issue for us in Libya is, of course, coordinating with with the government and then the other authority in the east of the country. Secondly, discovering the extent of the problem. We're not there yet in Libya. We don't know the extent of the problem.
For many in the Libyan community, the international aid effort is not coming fast enough.
I'm writing a petition today, started yesterday, for our parliament here to support, and we ask all the international community to support, really. It is a big disaster.
It is clear the damage caused by Cyclone Daniel will have a lasting effect. In Manchester, the community is helping with immediate assistance. But rebuilding devastated areas will take billions of pounds and many years.
I think the Eastern Libyan authorities are very sensitive to criticism, so any criticism that they have somehow failed in protecting their people is probably going to result in less access to the area and fewer journalists being allowed in and less criticism being allowed to air. Unfortunately, that's what happens in these fragile authorities. So I think that will happen. They say they've already started restricting people's access to the centre to just emergency relief workers. They're going to obviously want and need access to aid, and they don't seem to have stopped that as yet or restricted that, but they are going to need it, and they need the world to respond very, very quickly. They're already a bit slow. There's probably going to be outside pressure to get many more people on the ground and much more aid distributed, because unless they do that, the consequences for the actual Libyan civilians is you don't even want to think about that. Water was like a whole load of bombs.
Suddenly there is a huge torrent.
People just come and look in awe, just shocked.
The scale of this catastrophe is huge.
The geography of Derna has changed entirely. Everywhere you look here, it's 360 degrees destruction.